Started here. So first of all, welcome. Thank you so much for taking time out on this really rainy day to join us this morning. I know it's not pleasant out there, but I think you will enjoy this morning's talk, and I think you will leave here energized and happy and willing to go dance in the rain. So that's what my hope is. So I am thrilled to welcome Dr. Scott Sheiman this morning. He will speak to us about a blueprint for a better quality of working life. Dr. Sheiman is currently professor of sociology and department chair at the University of Toronto. He has co-edited 2 books, is the author of over 70 articles. He is currently the deputy editor, am I correct, of Society and Mental Health, which is a journal, and has also finished a 3-year term as the editor of the journal Sociology of Religion. His work focuses on 3 main areas: the sociology of health and mental health, work and stratification, and the sociology of religion. I found this out this morning, so I will say this. Time Magazine had a cover feature about 2 years ago. For those of you who get Time Magazine, 10 ideas that are changing your life, and his work on the stress of higher status was highlighted as one of the 10 ideas that will change your life. He received his MA and PhD from the University of New Hampshire, and I love this part, his BA from Millerville University. So I said earlier, I'm thrilled to welcome him back. I'm really even more thrilled to be able to say welcome back because, quite frankly, we've been trying to get him here for a few years. And I want you to know, I found this out last night too, he started his very illustrious career working for the Sugar Bowl as we were driving. And he said, the Sugar Bowl, I used to work there. So you never know, take a job and you may move up. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Sheiman. So.
Yeah, delivering pizzas. That was it was a fun time. Well, thank you, Carrie, for that introduction, and thanks for being such a great host over the past day and a half. And it's a real honor to be back. It's been a long time. And before I get started, I'd like to thank the organizing and planning committee for inviting me, Victor, for extending the invitation. And it was a real honor to get the call to come back. It's been a while. But before I do the talk, before I get into my talk, I couldn't resist. I had to dig this up. So this was my ID card when I first arrived. Can anybody guess what year? Look at the hair. Guess what year? I won't be insulted. Any guesses? I should stand. That's that. 1982. 95, I like that. No. Okay, 86, 1986. So I arrived here. Yeah, I used to people thought I looked like George Michael, not of Arrested Development, but of Wham. I don't know if I don't know. But I used to get called. And that was my dorm room. Madonna was cool back then, so I had Madonna on the wall. She's not really that cool anymore, but she's still around. That's good. Anyway, oh, God, what was the Bard? What was it called, Bard? Is that still there? Okay, anyway. So I have a lot of stories. I can tell stories after the talk. But one of the big things that I do want to say is that, and I'm going to start off on mentorship and I'm going to end on mentorship, that it really is true that over the years, so much of what I got here at Millersville has really shaped an important part of my life. Dr. Mary Glazier was my first Soc professor and really an inspiration. Dr. Rita Smith-Waddell, I loved her. I took 5 courses with her. I used to sit in her office and hang out. The funny story is I walked back over there yesterday to see her, and it was as if nothing changed. She was in her office with 4 students, chatting, laughing. I heard the laugh. She actually, and on a personal note, my brother passed away while I was a student here, and so Mary and Rita and Betty Finney, who I recently learned passed away, and Al Forsyth, and a host of other professors here actually went way beyond anything that I ever got in the textbooks and were constant sources of support. My brother was 6 years older than me, so it was a very traumatic time. And looking back, actually, it really has made all the difference for me. And so I'll start with that, but then I'll end on a personal note as well about the power of mentorship. And so, but my talk generally today, I was asked to talk about well-being and happiness. And so my career as a sociologist, so my degree here was in psychology, but over the years I sort of swerved off and went more towards sociology. But the way that I would characterize my work is really, I do a social psychology of inequality. So that's, if there was one broad kind of thing that connects all of my work, it is a social psychology of inequality, which obviously draws upon psychology, sociology, economics, a variety of other areas. And so in that process, I've really become interested in the quality of working life, especially as it relates to stress and well-being and health. And so I want to start off with this. So the dismal depiction of the disengaged worker is really sort of become a prominent feature in the public discourse about working life. But here's the problem, and it's an important problem. I think it's a bit overblown. And so the question is, where does it come from and why does it persist? Well, since the year 2000, the Gallup organization has reported a daily tracking of the percentage of engaged, what they call engaged workers. And you can see here from this screenshot that I took back in April, and in fact, I looked at it this morning. I didn't have time to take a screenshot, but it's so, one of the remarkable things, you can go on Gallup and it's so stable over time. They report it right alongside Obama's approval rating. It's kind of funny. It's like, it's that important, but it's there, and it, you know, and it's basically, it's more stable. Obama's approval rating goes up and down. Worker disengagement or engagement just goes flat across. So it's that important, and you can see that people, the way they're describing engagement, and I'll talk about this, but only 32% roughly are engaged at work. And you can see here that Canada and the US have the best levels of worker engagement. And I'll put best in quotes here because it's still rather dismal depiction. It's not that great. According to their reports, quote, 70% of workers are not engaged at work or actively disengaged. And the problem is even worse worldwide. They claim that in the aggregate, only 13% of workers are engaged. 13%. And of course, some in the media love this, right? Because it's like the more clicks you can get on a problem, or you know, or somebody says something. I was told one time when I was trying to write for a piece for the New York Times that they wanted more drama because drama gets clicks, and I'm like, but that's not this. That's sort of taking away of the integrity of the story. But drama gets clicks, so that's something I can talk about afterwards, engaging in public sociology, but how that plays out. In any case, a few weeks ago, for example, just picking up on the media theme, a Harvard Business Review article claimed, quote, the majority of employees are indifferent, sleepwalking through their workday without regard for their performance or their organization's performance, end quote. This is a Harvard Business Review. This is a widely circulated, highly respected media outlet. So they pick up, and of course Gallup is respected too, right? And actually, generally, I like Gallup's work, but on this one, I think it's problematic, and it's not necessarily a good thing for the public discourse on this. And so also recently, yeah, Forbes magazine's another big one, right? So Harvard Business Review, Forbes magazine, they warned organizations, quote, 70% of your employees hate their jobs, end quote. And then another quote, another year, another employee engagement poll by Gallup, another round of teeth gnashing. Despite small gains in 2014, a great majority of employees are still not engaged. So, and I could go on and on and on. There's even this Huffington Post infographic with, quote, 13 disturbing facts about employee engagement. And I'm just going to show you two here, but you can Google this. But I have to admit, so this is kind of funny. This screenshot, you can see over on the left are the issues related, but on the right, I kind of got a kick out of this. It says, I got a little distracted about these videos. Kung Fu Monkey drop kicked some jerk who gave it the finger. And this freaky video of an octopus chasing a crab will make your skin crawl. Oh, anyway, I thought that was kind of, you can look at those. So anyway, though, this is serious stuff. So while I'm being humorous about this, this is quite serious to say people hate their jobs, because we know that's strongly connected to happiness and well-being. If you hate something and it's part of your life and you're in it, it's not going to make you feel very good to be caught in that role or stuck in that role. The other thing here is the $50 billion mark every year in the US, and in Canada it's about $50 billion. So that's also, what do you do if there's a problem? You spend money to try to fix it. So this isn't important. If you're telling people there's a problem, people are going to put resources to that problem to try to fix it. But what if there really isn't a problem? What if the problem is overblown? Could those resources be put somewhere else? So at this point, you might be asking, and I've been asking for a while, what is disengagement? What is that? Well, this is a social science enterprise, so we seek to understand the extent of a particular problem in the population, but you need to ask the question, what are the methods behind the claim? And so, first, Gallup defines an engaged worker as a worker who is involved in, enthusiastic about, and committed to their work and workplace. To measure engagement, so they've sort of conceptualized it this way, and then to measure engagement, they use responses to a 12-item questionnaire. They call it the Q12. They've copyrighted it. They make money off of it. And sample items ask, for example, if you have a best friend in the workplace, if you think your coworkers are invested in performing well, and if you've received recognition in the past week. If you say no to those things, you're classified as disengaged. And there are other items as well. So Gallup then uses these responses to classify workers as engaged, not engaged, and actively disengaged. The actively disengaged are walking around the halls trying to undermine the organization. They're sabotaging, they're not doing the work. So the middle group is just sort of like, I'm looking at the clock, I can't wait to get out of here. But you can see they've sort of used the responses to then classify individuals, but those classifications have consequences because they flow back out to the public through the media, and then they shape. Gallup actually has a team of consultants that actually can then go to your organization and improve worker engagement. And they won't give you these items, so I'll talk a little bit about that. I've called Gallup repeatedly because part of what I like to do is sociology. I do a lot of public sociology and in some ways a little bit of investigative in some ways. So I've called Gallup and I've tried to get actually access to how they actually generate the classifications. Because again, in social science, like openness for research and so forth, I mean, that's one of the main themes, right? It's like a secret CIA locked document. They won't disclose it. And I have emails basically with things like, it's a proprietary formula, and it involves a lot of mathematical analytics. So essentially, if you're critical of that measure, it's basically they're saying too bad. But the thing that's puzzling for me, and again, in the Q&A, I like to talk about this stuff because it's interesting. It's fine to take these measurements and concepts, but they should be open to people to at least if you're interested in scrutinizing them, especially when it's such a money-making enterprise. The other thing is a lot of these items have been used by other researchers from what I can gather. So to copyright and put those in a kind of a lockbox seems a little strange to me that they can do that. Anyway, I'm worried about this disengaged worker depiction because I think if it's left unchecked, it's a rather dismal image that might fuel unwarranted pessimism among aspiring workers, for example, undergraduates who are about to plunge into the labor force. Why bother if the quality of working life is so poor? So that's precisely why I've sort of embarked on this effort to really help craft an alternative depiction and an alternative portrait that actually is trying to look at more of an optimistic promise for a better quality of working life. But luckily, we don't need secret procedures or special mathematical formulas to provide that alternative portrait. There's actually quite a bit of rich data sources that you could get right now. If you are online, you could go find them and actually take on the challenge of the disengaged versus engaged worker. So since the 1970s, publicly available and highly reputable data sources, including the national study of like the General Social Survey, and more recently, my work here in Canada on the Canadian Work Stress and Health Study. This is basically a study that I received a grant for, and I'm following 6,000 Canadians over 5 waves of time. So we started in 2011, 2013, 2015, we're right now finishing up 2017, and 2019 will wrap up. So we're following them over time and looking at changes. And then along the way, I'm also collecting qualitative interviews with subsets of the larger sample to study things like work-family balance, work-family multitasking, excessive pressure, and so forth. So the qualitative parts map onto the quantitative and actually both inform each other. And so I can talk a little bit about that. So, as I'll show today, the evidence from these studies and other sources tells a much more balanced and encouraging story. On average, and again, a lot of this is on average or in the aggregate, so keep that in mind. Sociology is about comparison, so we're looking at these aggregate data. Most workers say they have autonomous, interesting, and enriching work. Most feel respected, have good relationships with management, and feel proud to work for their employer. Most dedicate ample effort, feel satisfied, and have no intentions to leave. Now let me be clear, their jobs aren't perfect, so I don't want to swing so far in the other direction and say, oh, everybody's blissfully happy and their jobs are all perfect. So that's not what I'm trying to do here, but I am trying to challenge the claim that most workers are indifferent, most workers sleepwalk through their day, and most workers hate their employees. It's actually quite the opposite. So what I want to do is also, I recognize this is a conference sort of meant to have some takeaways that can help people. And often, even though I'm a sociologist, I basically feel like as though I do basic science. So I don't always have a, what can people do? As soon as you start doing this kind of research and talking to the media, I always get asked, so what can people do? Basically, people want either policy or specific things that individuals can take away. So I've been sort of forced and encouraged to kind of move in that direction. And what I thought was basically to try to summarize all of the research, mine and others, into what I see are the main components of a better quality of working life. And these involve 4 fundamental dimensions from what I can determine: control, challenge, connection, and commitment. And I just call it the 4C model because it's just easier to remember 4 Cs. You could label these other things, and the literature researchers call these different things. Like control is often also called decision-making latitude. That's too wordy. I just prefer control. But these are really important components, and sociological research, psychological research demonstrates that people who have a university degree, for example, have a better chance of achieving these dimensions. And I think it's true, especially if you majored in sociology. This is a tough crowd. Okay, no more jokes for me. I'm cutting. Okay, yeah. So, but more importantly, each of these things, just not anecdotal. Each of these things has been demonstrated in experimental, survey, qualitative studies to show that these often on balance, are associated with or correlated with or cause better health, better happiness, better well-being. Okay. So I'm going to unpack each of these and walk through them. And let's start with the first dimension, control. Given the pervasiveness of the disengaged worker narrative, you'd think that most workers experience little control at work. But data from the past decade contradicts that view. And these perceptions, by the way, it's sort of remarkable because the GSS goes all the way back to 1972. So on some of these indicators, some of these are remarkably stable. Even as there are big fluctuations and downturns and upturns, some of these indicators remain remarkably stable, which is sociologically interesting in and of itself. Because what's happening, you'd think some of this stuff for individuals would be tracking more closely to what's happening at the macro level, but it doesn't seem to be the case. So first of all, one of the main facts is most workers report a sense of autonomy and experience at least some degree of influence in decision making, and that's really critical. Okay, autonomy and influence in decision making. In addition, most workers tell us or others that they feel a good degree of certainty that comes with the clarity of expectations on the job and the sense that their jobs are secure. Those are really critical features. Clear expectations about clear expectations about the role, the job description, what's being expected, and also the sense of job security. So, and to be clear, there's going to be a lot of dog pictures in this one because, you know, to be clear, this is not the kind of control that I'm talking about. People think I'm talking about self-control, like, oh, I need that cookie, I can't wait to grab it and eat it. I'm not talking about that, or really the self-control in general is an important element here, but it's not exactly what I'm getting at here. It's more related to these kinds of items. So let me ask you, how many of you hope to have a job or currently have a job that gives you a lot of freedom to decide how you do your own work? It's a good thing. Oh, yeah, okay. So Now, I'm going to report different data. You can see the source. But what's fascinating, I'm from the US. I moved to Canada in 2004. And so my work is cross-national and compares. I thought there'd be bigger differences. Canadians are remarkably similar to Americans on a lot of these dimensions. There's maybe a plus or minus of 5 points on certain things. But in general, it's remarkably similar. I don't really have a working hypothesis of why it would be different. The healthcare stuff is different because there's universal healthcare. So on those fronts, people feel more secure about that, but on these kinds of things, there's not much difference. And about 6 in 10 in the Canadian study say that they've actually have this experience, but you can see there's definitely room for improvement. But again, the vast majority here feel they have the freedom to decide what to do. How about this one? How many of you want a job that gives you the chance to take part in decisions that affect you, where you have a lot of say on your job? Again, most of you would probably say yes. And again, 73%, about 7 in 10 workers report having this. And again, these are classic indicators. So again, if you're thinking of takeaways from this message, if there's useful things, people that score better on these do better in terms of health, well-being, and happiness. So one of the clear takeaways is on these, almost look at these as indicators of if you could shift the scale over more favorably in your own life, you're on balance, not always. Some people will still be dissatisfied and unhappy. But on balance, when that happens, people feel better. So that's one way to just literally think about moving it concretely. If you can shift these dials in your own experience, if it's possible to do that, then that's a key indicator. And this is another key one. You probably want a job where you know what's expected of you. You don't want to be plagued by what some sociologists call role ambiguity. We get a little jargon for role ambiguity on this. And you can see that 90% agree that on my job I know exactly what is expected of me. And this is a good thing. So the National Study of the Changing Workforce, which is a big US survey, again, these are all publicly available, so you could get this survey. It goes back to 1977. In work for personal growth and development, and you're not getting that, that's going to create some level of chronic role stress. And that is going to tamp down feelings of happiness and well-being. So you can see these kinds of things are quite prominent in the workplace, personal growth. So as an aside, one of my graduate students, John Koltai, and I have started to investigate if there are different kinds of challenging work, and this came out of our qualitative interviews, where people talk about challenging work, and there are shades of challenging work that are positive and shades of challenging work that are negative, and the negatives actually come around related to technology. Oh, they've upgraded again, I've got to learn something new again. I'm learning new things, I just learned the last one. Those actually, it's almost like the stress of trying to keep up, and especially if you're working in a knowledge industry where there's pressure to keep up and keep on top of things. And again, those aren't bad unless there's too much. So again, it's what's tolerable for most people is a different question. This is probably for me, I just became the chair of the department 3 months ago in sociology at U of T. And for me, the saving grace has already been connection. The social support in the workplace in different forms has actually been incredibly beneficial. I actually would probably, like a bridge that collapses under too much weight, probably would have already been like, I can't do this anymore, because the staff in particular have been so supportive. They know how to get resources. They know where, if they don't know the answer, they know the resources to help. But most people do when they're asked straight out, do you have a sense of pride about the way you work? It's a very unambiguous question, right? Most people say yes to that. So that's an important indicator. Why would you feel proud? I mean, unless there's some kind of strange dissonance associated with saying otherwise. No. This is just a random picture of me with a puppy, and I wanted to tell this. I figured it'd be a good time to take a little break. So I have to tell a story about Mary Glazer. So I'm gonna embarrass her. So when I was a student here, I used to go to her office. Is it Susquehanna House? Yeah. And she always had these great. He had one at the time, a yellow lab named Tess. And so after I left school, years later, I was living in Washington D.C. and I called Mary up and said, you know, I always loved going to your office because that dog was just so relaxing and calm. Where did you get that dog? And so she told me the name of the breeder. So over the years, my first dog, I named him Unagi. not after the Friends episode, but after the sushi. He passed away last year, and then I just got a new pup. This is a red lab. And actually, I had to show this picture because a friend of mine was driving and turned around and said, oh, let me get a picture. And he just put his, I didn't pose with him. He like, okay, a selfie. I mean, he just basically like, it's my favorite picture. I love this. So it was not posed. He set it up that way. Okay. Thank you. Oh, I'm going to blush. But I thank Mary, actually, and those dogs are great dogs. I can share with you the details later, but perfect dogs. Okay. So, and again, satisfaction. Now you can see here, I have issues with happiness, like the concept of happiness. I also have issues with the concepts of satisfaction because they're very, very, very subjective. And so, for example, satisfaction is quite complicated. Like if somebody called you up right now and said, how satisfied are you with your life? You'd have to sit here right now and like, what would you do? You'd sum up all the things that are going on right now and come out with spew out some kind of answer. Well, I'm extremely satisfied, very satisfied, somewhat. Very few people say they're not at all satisfied. Okay. And I'll talk a little bit about this maybe in the Q&A. The other thing that's fascinating is you'd think that things like education, for example, would improve job satisfaction, but study after study after study actually suggests it doesn't. And there's a whole set of reasons why. Some explanations relate to, well, the more education, you ratchet up your own expectations. And so when you get there, it's almost like there's a bit of disappointment. Another explanation that I prefer, which I've discovered, is actually with some of those higher statuses, Carrie mentioned the stress of higher status, that some of those higher statuses are associated with roles and responsibilities that actually counteract. They go against well-being. They go against, because they increase actually feeling rushed, feeling overwhelmed. And so that's a bit of a counteractive point that I wanted to talk about. Okay. So that was part 2. Part 3 is more related to the barriers. And here I want to move a little bit away from the quantitative stuff to talk more about the qualitative stories that we've done, because these are really, really rich. These are the stories that we've got from individuals in Canada and elsewhere. But I want to talk about the barriers to a better quality of working life. So I showed you the good things, and now to talk about the barriers. And there are 4 main overlapping kind of what I call pressure points, if you can imagine. Sort of overwork is a big one, especially long hours. I mean, there's only so many hours in a day, right? So if you want to split up your day into chunks of time, I mean, ideally you get about, 6 or 7 hours of sleep if you're lucky. So you get that. Of course, if hours spill over really long and then you have to come home and you have to deal with kids and other things, it just goes later and later into the night, and you hear women in particular talking about sleep erosion and sleep problems. The other part here is excessive job pressure, so excessive overload, time pressures. And then the other 2 pieces are related to role blurring. So this is kind of a new phenomenon, and this is something that I've been really interested in. Role blurring, blending work and family roles in particular, and how it's connected to work-family conflict. So I have just 3 objectives, and I'll close out with this. How much time? Okay. I want to unpack the very idea of work-life balance. So that's really one of my main important goals here, is to figure out how people think and talk about work-life balance. The other one is emphasize the major pressure points in the work-family interface. And these are things that some of you that are, if you're currently working and you have family, might be experiencing. And I finally want to just briefly talk about some ways to potentially alleviate some of these things. So I'm going to make a stab at a little bit of like how you can maybe change some of these things. And so one of the things that we did is in the national survey that I showed you, the big Canadian study, we took a random subsample of about 65 individuals who are in dual earner households. Okay, so men and women in dual earner households where both individuals are working full-time and they have kids in the household younger than 18. So it's a very specific group, but it's a group that's, if you hear ideas about juggling, really we'll talk about this a lot. And so we asked the question, how often does work interfere with family, and how often does family interfere with work? And there's evidence over the past decade that roughly 40 to 45% say that work interferes with life regularly. And so the word interferes is not good because it's very much specifically related to a stressor. Now, interestingly, over the same time span, just under 30% of workers report that family regularly interferes with their jobs. And that's a fascinating sociological question that I can't get into here today, but the directions of interference are not equal, and there are key reasons why that's the case, okay, because they're not equivalent kinds of roles. So it's the interference part that we're really trying to unpack in our research. So we've asked people about this and gotten an earful. Actually, this is, people loved, I mean, a lot of you are already nodding your heads. So a lot of people just really have, nearly half of Canadians, for example, reported they lack energy, time, and attention because their jobs often spill over into the other parts of their life. So one of the themes is commitment and priorities, and you hear things like trade-offs. I have to make trade-offs, and often those trade-offs are things that are not comfortable for people. So when people talk about work spilling over into personal life, it conjures up strong feelings about commitment and where they're placing their priorities. 30% told us that they put their job before their personal life regularly. So the job comes before their personal life. So we asked about this, and I'll tell you about the chocolate and peanut butter thing here. So we got philosophy. We wanted to talk about this in the qualitative interviews. We got great philosophies on work-life fit. So for example, this quote comes from a male chief technology officer working in Toronto. What you'll notice is a lot of these are higher status occupations. So that's the other dynamic that's fascinating here. Quote, I'm committed to my work, and when a client or a deal is in a dire situation and it looks like I can help, I will get on a plane and I will immediately go there. That's commitment. If my wife or my daughters are sick and in the hospital, I'm getting on a plane that night and going there immediately. Right now, no questions asked. Both are commitment. So he was sort of giving us an earful about this notion of commitment. Both are commitment, but it's completely contextual. Nobody's dying in the business world, but it isn't easy to compare them, work and family, and say that one is equal to the other. I put more hours of the day into my work than into my family on a general weekday. Does that make it a higher priority? No, it just requires more commitment of time. Work, family, they both exist. I'm glad they both exist. I like them both, you know, but it's like peanut butter interfering with chocolate or chocolate interfering with peanut butter, end quote. So he sees work and family as components that blend under the umbrella of life, not as separate domains. And I don't have time to get into it here. We're working on a book about this. But then the rest of the interview completely undermines his whole philosophy, where basically his wife, who's also a high status professional, ends up, like, he is able to get on a plane and go because she absorbs almost all of the domestic work and the child care. And so, and again, this isn't blaming men, but what was fascinating for us is these are well-educated, higher status, both with career aspirations. And we're not the first to discover this, but it's fascinating. I thought in Canada it'd be a bit more egalitarian, but you can see these kinds of trade-offs. And so his was just fascinating, the chocolate and peanut butter. A male computer systems analyst from Toronto saw it a bit differently, though. He said, quote, the problem is that your work is very set. So he didn't have schedule flexibility at all. Your work is very set, and your family will always be flexible. So I find that work wins out, and we hear that over, work wins out. So again, if you're trying to prioritize and have commitments to both roles, he said basically work wins out almost every time. You tend to change things at home, and you can always push off that movie with the kids. But that's what's interesting. He can, but when the women were telling us stories, if they do, they feel a lot more guilty for it. And so there's an emotional inequality embedded in these dynamics that's so rich that you'd never get with the surveys, but they do kind of bubble up in some ways to the more aggregate. So I feel once again that work kind of wins out, even though I don't think it should. Your family should come first, but that's hard to do. And so you get a lot of that too, and I wonder to what extent shoulds, like not being realized, make people feel really guilty. And guilt is a direct challenge to happiness. If you're feeling guilty all the time, are you happy? I guess you could be both, but it seems like those kinds of things would pull down happiness to some extent. Okay. This is a huge factor. And so this is one that I want to point out, something you can also change. Job pressures is a big one. But this comes from the idea that work is a greedy institution. So Louis Kozer, a sociologist back in the 70s, before all of the communication technologies that can get us anywhere at any time, he came up with the idea that work is a greedy institution, meaning that it'll reach and grab and take as much of your energy and time and attention as you allow it. Well, that was before all the stuff that we have now. Now it just can do it all the time, 24/7 for a lot of people. And so this brings up the idea of ideal workers. What's an ideal worker? It's one who's fully committed to their employers and able to work overtime without much notice. But I can tell you what's happened is the role blurring expectations increase. So a male respondent who's in his 40s and works as a manager at the Federal Public Service in Ottawa explained it like this. The BlackBerry is always on, and I find that I'm always checking it, but I've never been actually told that you have to check it on the weekends or at other points. But you know, there's email coming all the time at all hours, and I check it, and then I often respond. My eyes are always on that red flashing light, which means I'm not fully disengaged from my work. Now, he's using engagement in a different way. That's basically like when you're done work, you're not thinking about work, you're switching into another role, whether it's leisure, if you're lucky to have leisure, or your kids, or whatever else. So that's what I mean by role blurring. In other words, if you're working not, like at Hot Diggity Dog, I worked at 9, and then I ended at 5, and I didn't think about hot dogs the rest of the night. There was no role blurring. But this job, I'm like, yesterday I slipped out of the conference and went to the library, sat in the old library. It's totally different from when I was there. But I was answering emails, and those emails were filled with demands, problems, and they're complicated. So they require reading, thinking about the responses, because also with higher status positions comes the responsibility that what you say just has more importance. Because if you say the wrong thing to the wrong person, to the dean, for example, it's there in email. It's never going away. And so it's a different, the dynamic's completely different. But the role blurring is, and we talked about this in the car on the way over, like I've had to stop checking emails later at night because I was having issues of, I was checking up until like 9, and then if a bad one comes in or a mean one and workers can be mean. If a work one comes in that's mean, I'm not one of those people that's able to compartmentalize and be like, okay, shut that aside and go to sleep. Think about it. And then what happens is the sleep quality goes down, the irritability the next day goes up, and you know, people experience this stuff all the time. Okay. This is a joke. This is my grad student at Sushi, Narasada. He sent me an email at 3 a.m. This is exactly what I'm talking about. Now, grad school is a little different. You're up all the time, but I just tease him about this. I'm like, why are you sending me emails at 3 a.m.? And you know, the funny thing is that we were talking about this. I've gotten emails. I had an experience recently from a colleague who sent me an email at 10:45 p.m. And then at midnight, I got another email that was quite angry. And basically, it was almost as if the expectation was that I should have responded. And I'm like, well, I'm asleep. But the next morning, he's like, are you going to get back to me? And it's that, those are pressures. Now, again, some people might just be able to be like, whatever. But those are pressures, right? I mean, those are like, where is it? I want the resource. And if you have a lot of those on you, it can take a big toll. Okay, I'm going to move along a little, taking a little bit more than I thought. I think the other thing is I got a lot of good quotes from some of the women in the survey, and I think, or in the qualitative, but I think what I'll do is I'll just close out because, and I can come back and talk about those, but I wanted to leave about 30 minutes for we have until 12:30, right? So just for more of a discussion. Doing a good job at home. And then the other thing is a lot of, the whole notion of balance is basically, a lot of people say, I don't see balance. It's more about fit. I need the workplace to be able to match the specific needs. I have a child I need to pick up at 3. I need to go do that. And again, the women are the ones usually, actually, even if the arrangements are maybe that the man will go do it, women told us, well, we're often called by the school anyway, so we go. I mean, there's a default assumption that women, if there's a man and a woman and kids, that the default assumption is women will take on those roles. And actually, some of the men that have done it will talk a lot about stigma, the stigma associated with sort of a penalty, like, why are you doing that? And again, that's going to vary by culture, so more traditional versus more egalitarian. But Canada's pretty progressive and pretty egalitarian when it comes to these things. So, and then also the overwhelmed, there's a peace story there. A woman was talking about, she feels like her life a lot of times as she's walking around, when we asked her about balancing work and family, and she said, I feel like I've got a plate of peas, and at any moment, like they're gonna go flying off. And she underscored that her partner, her husband, is not available for support. So we're remarkably candid individuals talking about this. And that's the key. If the support's not there, that has problems for happiness. So if you feel that way and you're not getting the support, compare that to households where people feel overwhelmed, but they do feel like somebody's got their back, at least part of the time. Okay, so these are just some takeaway points, and I'd be happy to share these slides with people later if you want some more of these details. But keep an eye on the overload. Notice the culture of work and what I call bad norms. So for example, by bad norms, I mean workplaces that give you flexibility. Flexibility, I mean you can start and finish your end times and so forth, but then layer on top of that there's an expectation that you should be available and responsive. So in other words, the flexibility is a way that they channel more pressures. So yeah, take some time off, but then when you're off, you're still being asked to do things. And there are laws against that, but they're trickier when you're basically salary, right? Because you're not punching in and punching out. If you're just sort of like, well, basically the work hours creep up to about 50 for some people. And people talk about work creep. Well, how did it get there? I'm not actually getting paid extra, but I'm doing more. And so those are issues. Okay. The other big thing that I've found recently that helps is mindfulness, because when you're feeling rushed and you're feeling overwhelmed, you often lose sight of the fact the stuff that really matters. And so I've actually spent a lot of time, it's quite helpful, just reminding, there's some great books on mindfulness. There's a book called Mindful Leadership if you're in a leadership role. They're reminders about how to be clear, present, focused in a world where there's often a lot of chaos, especially if you're very busy. So these are actually, you kind of almost need some of these reminders, I feel. Okay. I want to end, a little rushed, but I want to end on a personal note, because what I have found, even though mentoring is not a theme, I felt like, because I was coming back to Millersville, I thought, because it was such a powerful part of my life, and in fact, in a way, it has helped shape a lot of what I talk about and what I study and how I approach it. Because I feel like the thread that connects all of this is related back to the quality of the relationships that you have. And the quality of those relationships relate to mentoring. So I wrote this piece. Part of what I do in Toronto is I write a regular column for the national newspaper. It's called the Globe and Mail. And so one of my pieces was on mentoring. So I'm just going to read from that. Are you crazy? This was how colleagues reacted to the news that I was considering leaving my assistant professor position at the University of Miami. Tenure-track jobs were scarce back in 2000, and they still are. Leaving that security for a temporary research post at the University of Maryland was called risky. But my gut felt differently. The sociologist Leonard Perlin, we knew him as Len, was recruiting me to help direct his study of aging, stress, and health. Now, I didn't know Len personally, but during my graduate training, I learned of his status as a foundational figure in my area of research, the sociological study of stress. So I packed my bags and left Maryland and I packed my bags and left Miami and headed up to Maryland. And it was one of the best decisions I've ever made. During those 4 years with Len, we'd often share the commute after work. He dropped me off at what was called Friendship Heights, which is kind of it's interesting, it was called Friendship Heights. He would drop me off at this metro station near his home, and then I'd hop on the subway back to my condo down in Washington, D.C. And on the way to Friendship Heights, Len would share insights about the history of stress research, the intellectual puzzles that remained, but it was Len's many personal stories that contained the real lessons. For example, I learned that he fought in World War II, and he received the Purple Heart after being wounded. And when his two older brothers were killed in the war, Len was sent home during the sole surviving son policy. And I think, wasn't that movie Save It Private Ryan? So he was basically Saving Private Ryan. He told me this story one time of he was fighting over in the Philippines, and he came around a corner, like a bush or something. He came around a corner, and he was face to face with a Japanese soldier, and they both had their guns pointed at each other. Basically, like just, and they simultaneously just, they backed away and just walked away. And there's story after story like that, and you know, he would reflect on it. I was with him at the moment at 9/11. We were in his office, and it was a little black and white TV. It was strange, a little black and white TV, and we were both sitting there. And when the first building collapsed, and we just sort of like looked, it was almost surreal. Like, I still have that image in my mind. But he passed away. He was 89. But you know, and he had seen it all, and he turned to me and said, this is just going to change everything. And it was just I'll never forget that moment. And so he would talk about what that meant. I'm like, what do you mean change everything? And he basically predicted everything that has essentially happened since. In any case, from my experience with him, I got the sense that great losses in his life really left a deep impression, and I learned about how to handle loss in a lot of ways. But also, two elements about mentoring I think are really important, and it's something I'd like to leave today: openness and generosity. I think those things really enhance our life chances and our well-being, and certainly our happiness, because they inform our experiences of adversity. And let's face it, life is filled with adversity, so you need to be equipped to be able to deal with those adversities. But mentors help you thrive and figure out how to flourish. Mentors see something in you, but you need to be open to it. And that's something also I've learned over the years, how to be open to that. This requires being comfortable revealing aspects of yourself, especially your flaws. If you were perfect, you wouldn't need a mentor. But to grow, you must be willing to think, act, and feel differently. I think that's really the key, because people hold on to the way they are. I'd say share your limitations with others and ask, what would you do differently? How would you say it? How would you do this? There are boundaries, of course. Oversharing isn't wise. Mentors provide an opportunity to learn what and how to share, which is kind of a hidden benefit. So how to share things is really quite critical. The appropriate, effective form of communication. It also helps you to recognize how mentors deal with being busy. If their door is always open to you, it's probably always open to others too, like Rita Smith, Waddell. They have their own stressors and might sometimes be distracted. So this also requires learning to read socio-emotional cues about the timing of your approach. And again, all of those come into play in everything that I talked about here, especially connection. A good mentor demonstrates the benefits of failure. Doesn't sugarcoat it, but demonstrates the benefits of it. In that process, you'll learn how to receive criticism, but also how to give it. It's remarkable how many people don't know how to give good, effective criticism in a way that's productive. You hear the structure and tone of questions that solicit useful feedback. In response to rejection, a good mentor can turn self-doubt on its head and generate an optimistic perspective. This is really an essential ingredient for motivation. No book and no journal ever taught me about the value of persistence. Mentors did. And it's a very good thing that they're not perfect themselves. You can learn from their mistakes and shortcomings. Watch what a mentor does when she fails. How does she handle it? Flexible thought and judgment are often modeled in ways you wouldn't necessarily notice. And also, oddly enough, they also unwittingly offer opportunities for you to see alternative, perhaps better ways of doing things. Over the years, I've witnessed actions by my mentors and thought, I do that slightly differently. I never thought that about Mary, but yeah, all the other ones I've thought, yeah, I would do that differently. So back to Len, and I just want to close on Len Perlin. Last June, upon hearing news that he wasn't doing well, my colleague Blair Wheaton, who's also very close with Len, and I drove to Virginia Beach, where Len lived with his wife, Jerry. And so Blair and Len were longtime friends and colleagues in the burgeoning years of the sociological study of stress, so they were kind of the founding figures. Over a few shared meals, our conversations were lively and engaging. Len was slower and frailer, but seemed well and in good spirits. Before Blair and I departed, I'll never forget this, the three of us walked to the beach and sat silently together on the beach, just kind of looking out at the ocean. It sounds cheesy, but it was almost kind of like this was the right thing to kind of do. And I have that image in my mind that we just sat there, words weren't really necessary. A few days after our visit, I received an email from Len. Hi, Scott. I'm enormously grateful for your visit. My main complaint is that it was far too short, although we seem to have covered a lot of ground in a brief time. I also regret that you guys had to slowly negotiate your way through heavy traffic on your way down. Please don't let these hardships of travel discourage you from a return visit. I enjoyed very much hearing about your research writing agenda. Indeed, I'd love to learn more about it. Put me down for any pieces you produce. Our very best, Len. Well, this was our last correspondence. 3 weeks later, Len passed away at the age of 89. An obituary described Len as, quote, one of the finest mentors in the discipline, end quote, and that, quote, he always had time to encourage and support the work of others. He set a standard, he modeled a genuine curiosity about ideas and a sometimes obsessive pursuit of the unresolved puzzles of social life. Through their acts of generosity, mentors inspire creativity and innovation. Over the years, I've heard encouragement like, push that idea further, I know you can. Small gestures like that can be felt deeply and have unforeseen effects. When mentors give you these gifts, accept them and let yourself thrive and flourish. Then, if you can, try to give those gifts to somebody else. Create your own mentorship journey. As I discovered on the way to Friendship Heights, I really feel like it's made all the difference. Thanks. So I tried to leave we have about 25 minutes. I rushed through a little bit of the qualitative stuff. The stories, I got a little caught up. But if you want, I'd happy to answer any questions about the work or anything, frankly, about because of my experiences here and anything you're puzzled by. Should we go get lunch? Want me to talk more about the puppy? No. Yeah.
How did you pick your 6,000 respondents for your study?
Oh, okay.
Good job, stats student.
How did we select? So we tried to follow, so the question was, how did we select the 6,000 respondents? So what we did is we tried to get a nationally representative sample broadly across respondents, across occupations, across regions. So they did sort of a regionally, I can give you the technical details later, but it followed a standard methodological procedure where you try to get a broad cross-section that's generally representative. It's harder to do that in these days, but so we use cell phones and all of that. So yeah, and then actually all of the analyses we're able to map it back onto the Canadian census. So the census is the more complete portrait of the population. So most of the analyses, what we do is we weight. So in other words, that might help correct some of the balance and some of the findings. But I can talk more about the technical, the clustered analysis and that kind of thing. I don't want, does that help? Yeah. Yes?
Do you have any thoughts about why there's such a great discrepancy in the Gallup polls and in what's being fed in some ways to the American public about this disengagement and then what you're finding otherwise?
So, yeah, so that's what I was trying to find out. And so actually I wrote an op-ed about this. This is really, I try to do more public sociology. So when I discovered that, I actually started to read over and over these reports, like Harvard Business Review, Forbes, and it's elsewhere too. Like if you just Google like Gallup's disengaged worker, it's like they've created the narrative. I mean, if you're interested in sort of a sociology of knowledge or like, this is fascinating because they have created this, I call it a myth of the disengaged worker. And I suspect, I have emails, they basically almost told me like, you're not allowed to write about this, you're not, it's like secret classified documents about Iraq or something, you know, like. My main idea is they have 12 questions, just like the questions that I posed to you, but different wording. And if you say, for example, the best friend item, like I don't have a best friend at work. I have good friends at work, but I also feel like best friend is something I had in high school. Like, you know what I mean? But if you say no to that, and then you say no to enough of the other items, you're a disengaged worker. I'm like, what? I'm like not a disengaged worker. I don't have a best friend at work. Nobody's actually thanked me in the past week. In the past maybe 6 months I've been thanked, but I would have to say no. Nobody's thanked me in the past week. It's a thankless job. If your chairs know that. But you accept that. But so I would have to say no to the best friend, no to the recognition. And I actually tried to get the other items. They charge you for the 12 items. So my whole thing is I was pressing them on like, how did you come up with the actual figures? They won't tell you. It's insane. I have emails that like, we're not going to tell you. I'm like, okay. And I suspect this is the thing, because I have a friend who works at Deloitte, which is a consulting. Should probably be careful. The camera's on. Yeah. And that literally, no, one of their emails was like, if you write too much about it, like they have a copyright on this stuff. So my sense is that they use this as a tool to actually help organizations figure out their level of engagement, and then they have consultants go in to fix the disengagement problem. And you know that sounds, but I've tried to get this published. I tried different outlets, and it's sort of funny. Anybody that uses Gallup probably won't publish something like this, right? And I have to say, though, I generally actually do this. The weird thing is I generally like Gallup's work, so I should say that. Like, I think the approval ratings, I think that stuff is pretty solid, because there are the items. Like, do you approve of Obama or not? Like, you can all see what those items are. Thumbs up, thumbs down. But these are like this murky, you know, and as a social scientist, like that's not what we do. So for example, your question about the 6,000, if I responded, sorry, I can't tell you how we actually got those 6,000, you'd be like, well, how can I gauge whether it's a credible study? You can't, sorry. So that's literally what Gallup has said with this. And actually, if you look closely enough, others have written about this. I started digging, but they're buried in like very small papers. So I've tried CNN, I've tried like New York Times, I tried Harvard Business Review, I tried all of these outlets. They won't take yeah. So I don't know. I don't know what's driving it, and actually though, you can go to any of these national data sets if you're interested, and you don't even have to have much of a stats background, and you can see it's just not accurate. It's not perfect, so I don't want to go the other way and say, oh, everything's great, this Pollyanna, you know, like, oh, everything's wonderful. But it's definitely not like 13% of the world, you know, is engaged. I don't know, do you have any follow-up or?
No, it's really interesting thoughts. You know, as you were saying, you want to take that conspiratorial edge, but it is interesting to think about, because I think it's a place to keep workers almost, as if you feel disengaged.
Yes. Yeah.
You.
So I've talked about this with friends who are outside academia, and they say the exact, like there's almost this kind of weird like, oh, well, maybe it's a little bit, it's layered in like social control. Like, well, maybe if workers think that it's so bad out there, they'll kind of stick with what they have, or some kind of weird, like it's like there's some kind of weird like conspiracy between like I don't know about that. I actually just think it's a matter of, to be frank, it's a crappy measure. But you can't show that it's a crappy measure because you actually can't get it. You can figure out some of the items. So for example, you can figure out what some of those items are, but you can't figure out how they get the percentages. Like this group is, you know, disengaged. Like I have no idea. I can't tell you who's actively disengaged. I mean, they'll tell you they're the people roaming around backstabbing, but they don't actually ask that question as far as I can tell. Yeah, other question?
I'd be interested to know the differences in the economic, socioeconomic status, like they have. The McDonald's worker, the disgruntled worker, versus the IBM high status
Yeah.
worker.
Happier.
Maybe people at McDonald's with lower status jobs are more vocal, and that's what we're hearing. And that might have something to do with the narrative.
Oh, I see. So definitely socioeconomic status and occupation are important to me. So again, in some ways, one critique could be a lot of this is much more of a professional managerial story. But remember, all of these data are nationally representative, so we can actually break it down and look at different occupations and so forth. But you're saying maybe people are willing at different levels to report discontent or yeah. So my main thing about different levels, it's a little bit of a different answer, but thinking about the talk last night, like the keynote, I'm less interested in, quote, whether somebody says I'm happy. Like if you all got buzzed right now on your phone or asked by like an app to, okay, right now, how happy are you? And you'd answer. Like, how meaningful is that? Rather than, or if I asked you a series of questions about symptoms related to anxiety and depression, like a battery of questions where you really get at like how people are feeling. And I think in those instances, workers, there's no question that workers who are in routinized, boring, repetitive kinds of work that is actually also noxious, has like hazardous elements, they have a certain kinds of stressor experience that's very different than somebody who's, say, a manager, a mid-level manager who has pressures above and pressures below. They're qualitatively different stressors, but they're both important, and because they both erode well-being. But I think in the end, like, it's almost like two different stories. There's the broad stories of like, does money buy happiness? And then there's the other story of within particular social roles, it's more like on the ground, within particular social roles, work, family, what's happening in the quality of those roles that's causing feeling worried, feeling tense, feeling anxious, feeling insecure, feeling sad, feeling down. And so that's almost more of like a psychological distress package, where happiness and satisfaction are more of like these global states, you know. Yeah.
Kind of along the lines, I think the important thing, you need to gauge what someone wants to gauge their happiness, because some people don't want to be challenged at work. Some people don't want, so you can't just ask that question and then assume that they're dissatisfied because they aren't being challenged, or because they're not being given control.
Right.
Because maybe they don't want it. So I think it is kind of.
So that's an important question, because then the issue really becomes all of these things like, so my supervisor is supportive when I have a work problem. So in general, I think most of you would think that's a good thing, right? Support. But you could argue like, well, maybe I don't want her support. And that's really fascinating, because if support shades into micromanaging, but then would you label it support? That's the thing. Like, okay, I get it. I get that you're like supporting me, but it could almost shade into like you're doing my job. So if support erodes your autonomy, you're not going to be happy. But also, this comes up a lot. What do people want? What do people expect? Like, what does a low-wage worker expect? Would a low-wage worker expect to be involved in decision making? Well, you'd be surprised. I think in some ways, they're almost qualitatively different. So in some instances, some reaction could be, well, doesn't this vary so much by the job? And that's a fair point. But then when you look in the aggregate, these things play out for well-being across those kinds of jobs. So yeah, they're almost like resources that are differentially distributed across those kinds of jobs. But when people do have those resources, they definitely are better off. So yeah, the wants question is a really good one.
So basically, you're saying that across the board, control, the job itself doesn't matter. It's how you feel about it. Do you have control? Do you feel challenged, connected? The pay and the job you're doing really doesn't matter. It's whether you have a sense of control.
Yeah. So this is tricky. So as a sociologist, I'm interested in the aggregate patterns. So basically, it's like comparing people who say I have a lot of say about what happens on my job to people who say I don't have a lot of say on what happens on my job. In the aggregate, the people that have a lot of say do better, feel better on a variety of outcomes. That's not to necessarily negate the possibility of a contingency, but that's almost like a separate next step. So in other words, would that association be stronger if you cut it by, well, these people really want to have a lot of say. And these people are like, I'm shy, I don't want to be, you know, there's also all kinds of questions about selecting into the job. So does the person select into a job? Like does somebody, you know, it's type A personality stuff, which I'm not crazy about, because I feel like, how can I say this without offending psychologists? Yeah. So I mean, I have a psychology background, but I've been at psych conferences where they'll talk about the overcommitted worker, as if the worker is deciding to be like, and then they'll describe what they mean, and it's like a woman who wakes up at 7, who's sitting at the breakfast table with her kids, but she's catching up on email. And I'm like, well, why are you calling her overcommitted? It's like blaming the individual. It's like, or workaholic. It's one of my least favorites. Because often if you peel back the whatever, you peel back the layer, you actually see it's because the organization has given the worker so much to do and not enough time to do it. So she's not overcommitted. It's like a weird, and so I've said that at psychology conferences, and it's almost like people turn, and I'm like, I'm with you, but I just feel like you have to be careful. Like if you call somebody a workaholic, we call people an alcoholic. What it's like, that's your thing. If you call somebody a workaholic, I'm like, I'm answering emails now at 9 because I can't do that during the time that you've given me at work. So I have a staff that they're all overwhelmed. They're all overloaded. So I've now reached out to get more staff, but they're working like overtime to catch up. I don't know if I'd feel comfortable calling them workaholics. Basically because I'm now in the organization and I see why they're doing it. They don't want to be working on a Sunday. You see, you know, so so I think the psychology side of this sometimes can get a little tricky. Yeah.
What you're saying makes me think, though, about the idea of alienation. Somebody who is working because of necessity to work, but it isn't really who they are.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to somebody, somebody whose occupation.
Yeah.
So I've been out for years, and it is who I am.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mind the idea that I work in the evening or on a Saturday or a Sunday. A burden. It's part of what I would be doing. Why wouldn't I be doing that? Because that's my idea. I've also had jobs where, it was a good job, it was an interesting job, it was valuable employment. But, when time ended, I walked away from it because it wasn't who I was.
Yeah.
So, I don't know how that notion,
Mm-hmm.
and this idea of overcommitment and almost the pejorative
Right.